She was 21 years old when the wagon master gave the order to leave her on the trail. And though she was still breathing, still conscious enough to hear every word he spoke, he told the others she would not last the night, and that the party could not afford to lose another day waiting on a dying girl. His name was Amos Kettering, and he had taken her on as a paying passenger 3 weeks before, promising her safe passage west to an aunt in the San Joaquin Valley, after her father's death left her with nowhere else to go. When raiders struck their small train at a river crossing and a stray bullet caught her side, Kettering decided, with the cold arithmetic of a man protecting his own investment, that one wounded orphan was not worth the wagons and lives it might cost to carry her further. He left her a blanket, a tin cup, and nothing else, and rode on with her trunk still lashed to his wagon. She dragged herself, over 2 days and nights she barely remembered, toward a crumbling bell tower rising out of the chaparral, her mind fixed on nothing but the next handhold of scrub grass, the next shallow breath that didn't tear at her wound, the next inch of ground. And there, in the ruin of a mission church abandoned for 40 years, she was found alive by an old woman who should not have still been living there at all. And it was only weeks later, once her wound had closed and her strength returned enough that she could walk the ruined cloister without leaning on Refugio's arm, that she understood the mission held a secret sealed behind its altar that no one had dared disturb in 4 decades, one that would restore far more than her own broken body. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calder. Before we go further, if you found your way to a story like this one, we'd be glad to have you stay with us. Press follow or subscribe now, because Josephine's story is the kind best watched all the way through, and you won't want to miss where it leads. Josephine had been raised in a succession of small towns across the Midwest, wherever her father's work took them, for Elias Calder had been a traveling apothecary and healer of the old country style. A man who trusted tinctures and poultices as much as he trusted the newer medicines coming out of the Eastern colleges, and who had taught his only daughter everything he knew because there had been no son to teach, and because, as he told her more than once, a mind sharp enough to learn deserved the teaching regardless of what the world expected of it. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had always been the two of them, moving from town to town in a covered cart stocked with dried herbs and glass bottles. Elias treating fevers and broken bones and the quiet griefs of frontier families who had no doctor for 100 miles, and Josephine, from the time she could walk, at his side learning to grind willow bark for pain, to boil yarrow for wounds, to read the Latin names printed on his oldest reference volumes, inherited from his own father, a Spanish-trained physician who had practiced for a time in the Californias before the family moved east. It was her grandfather's old books that gave Josephine her strangest gift, one she did not yet know would matter. She could read Latin and passable Spanish, taught to her by her father in idle evenings the way other girls were taught embroidery, because he believed a healer should be able to read whatever the sick and dying left behind, in whatever language they'd been given. Elias also taught her patience, the particular patience of a healer who cannot rush a fever or force a wound to close faster than the body allows, who must sit through the worst of a night simply being present, doing the small necessary things, and trusting that morning would come. He used to tell her that most people mistook patience for weakness, when it was in fact the hardest kind of strength there was, the strength to keep doing careful work when no one is watching and no reward is promised. Josephine remembered one particular night in a Kansas railhead town when she was perhaps 16, when her father was called out to a farmhouse where a young mother lay in a difficult labor that had already gone on through 2 full days, and how the local midwife, exhausted and out of remedies, had all but given up hope for either mother or child. Elias had sat through the remainder of that night, with a patience that seemed almost inhuman to Josephine, who assisted him, doing nothing dramatic, only small necessary things, cool cloths, quiet words, the careful administration of herbs in exact and unhurried doses, until, near dawn, the crisis broke and both mother and child survived. Riding home afterward, half asleep in the wagon seat beside him, she had asked her father how he had known to simply wait rather than act more forcefully. And he told her that the hardest lesson of healing was learning to tell the difference between a moment that called for boldness and a moment that called for nothing more than steady, unglamorous endurance, and that mistaking one for the other could cost a life either way. She carried that lesson forward without fully understanding then how directly it would one day apply to her own survival. Josephine absorbed this the way she absorbed everything he offered her, quietly, thoroughly, without complaint, and by the time she was 17 she was as capable a healer as men twice her age who called themselves doctors, though no diploma would ever say so. And more than one town they passed through offered to pay her father double if he would leave her behind to tend their sick permanently. Offers he always declined gently, telling them a healer belonged wherever the need was greatest, not wherever the pay was highest. Her father grew ill the winter she turned 20, a wasting sickness he recognized in himself before she did, and diagnosed with the same clinical honesty he'd have used for a stranger. And in his last weeks he told her, with more urgency than she had ever heard from him, that she must go west to her mother's sister in California, that a young woman alone in the world needed family, however distant, and that he had already written ahead and arranged her passage with a wagon train leaving that spring. He died in early March, and Josephine buried him herself, with the help of a kind neighbor, in a small churchyard she would never see again, carrying forward from those years not wealth, not connections, but a healer's hands, a Spanish reading mind, and a patience that would prove, in the months ahead, to be the only inheritance that truly mattered. The wagon train Elias had arranged her passage with was led by Amos Kettering, a man whose reputation for getting parties through difficult country was matched. Josephine would learn too late, by a reputation among those who knew him best for making hard decisions in his own favor whenever the trail turned dangerous. She had paid him the last of her father's savings for her place among the wagons, keeping only a small hidden reserve of coins sewn into her hem, a habit her father had taught her as a precaution any traveling healer's daughter ought to know. For the first weeks the journey passed uneventfully enough, Josephine making herself useful tending the minor injuries and illnesses that always plagued a train of that size, earning a grudging respect from families who had been skeptical of a woman doctoring anyone at all. But 6 weeks in, camped at a river crossing in country that had grown increasingly unsettled by rumors of raiding parties displaced by encroaching settlement, the train was struck at dawn by a band of riders, whose grievances, whatever they were, expressed themselves in gunfire and stampeding stock. In the chaos, a stray shot caught Josephine low in the side as she ran to reach a wounded child, and she went down hard in the dust, conscious but unable to rise, watching the world tilt and blur around her while wagons scrambled to regroup and flee. It was Kettering who found her there minutes later, and it was Kettering who, kneeling over her only long enough to judge the wound too grave and the hour too dangerous, made the calculation that would define the rest of her life, that a girl who might die regardless was not worth risking the train's survival to carry, and that the kindest lie he could offer the others was that she had likely already passed. He took the blanket from his own bedroll, more out of some vestigial guilt than mercy, laid it over her, set a tin cup within reach should she wake, and gave the order to move on before the raiders could regroup. One of the younger drivers, a boy named Caleb who had grown fond of Josephine's quiet kindness, over the weeks of travel, protested loudly enough that Kettering had to raise his voice to silence him, reminding the boy sharply that the train carried 11 families whose survival depended on reaching the next water stop before their own supplies gave out. And that sentiment was a luxury none of them could afford in country like this. Caleb obeyed, as frightened 17-year-olds obey men who hold authority over them. But he would carry the memory of Josephine's still form receding behind the wagons for the rest of his life, a guilt Josephine herself would not learn of until many months later, in a letter that found its way to her long after the mission had already changed everything. Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness for what she later understood must have been 2 full days, crawling when she could, resting when she couldn't, following an instinct she could not name toward a shape on the horizon that resolved, as her fever worsened, into a crumbling bell tower rising from a sea of dry chaparral. The last remnant of a place she had no way of knowing was called Mission San Cirilo de la Piedra. She would remember very little of her final approach to the mission, only fragments, the cool shock of shadow as she crossed its threshold, the smell of old stone and dust, and then a face bending over hers, brown and deeply lined, framed by silver hair worn in a long braid. An old woman's voice speaking first in Spanish and then in careful, accented English, telling her she was safe, that she must be still, that help was already here. The old woman's name was Refugio, though everyone who had ever known her simply called her Nana Fuga, and she had lived alone in the ruined mission compound for longer than anyone in the nearby town of Piedra Alta could quite remember, tending a small garden in the old cloister yard and asking nothing of anyone, regarded by most as a harmless eccentric who had simply never left the place she was born to. She nursed Josephine through the worst of the fever, with a competence that startled the younger woman even in her delirium, packing the wound with herbs Josephine recognized from her father's own recipes, boiling water with an instinctive understanding of cleanliness that most frontier medicine had not yet caught up to, and Josephine understood, in the lucid moments between fevered sleep, that she had been carried not merely to shelter, but to the one place in 100 miles where someone still possessed the old knowledge to save her. It took nearly 3 weeks before Josephine could sit upright without the room spinning, and in that time Refugio told her, in fragments offered a little at a time as trust grew between them, the history of the mission, how it had been built generations before by Franciscan friars and the indigenous families who lived and labored there, how it had thrived as a center of the valley's life until the Mexican government secularized the missions in the 1830s, stripping the church of its lands and scattering its people, and how the mission's last resident priest, a man named Padre Anselmo Vega, had died within these very walls the year Refugio herself was born, leaving behind, so the old stories said, something he had hidden before the secularization commissioners arrived to strip the church bare. Refugio herself did not know what it was. She only knew that her own grandmother, one of the mission's last neophyte residents, had been present the night Padre Vega sealed something behind the altar, and had spent the rest of her life believing it was not her place to disturb what a dying priest had chosen to hide. Once Josephine's strength had returned enough to walk the mission grounds unassisted, she spent whole mornings simply looking, the way her father had once taught her to look at anything before deciding what it was worth, the roofless nave open to the sky where birds now nested in the old rafters remains. The cloister garden Refugio had kept alive against all odds with cactus and hardy herbs, the faded remnants of painted saints still visible on plaster walls that had somehow survived 40 seasons of sun and rain, and the old bell, cracked but intact, lying half-buried in fallen adobe near the base of the tower where it had fallen decades before. She learned that the property, having sat abandoned and untaxed for decades under a tangle of unresolved secularization claims, was scheduled to be sold at a county land auction in Piedra Alta that very month. The territorial government finally moving to clear its books of old ecclesiastical holdings nobody had bothered to formally claim. Refugio, too old and too wary of officialdom to attend such things herself, had resigned herself to watching the only home she'd ever known pass to some rancher or speculator who would likely tear the old adobe walls down for building stone. Josephine, with the small hidden reserve of coins still sewn into her hem, and a debt of gratitude to Refugio that she could not otherwise repay, walked the 8 miles into Piedra Alta on legs still unsteady from her convalescence, and stood at the back of a dusty auction yard while a bored county clerk read out a list of derelict properties nobody wanted. When Mission San Cirilo came up, described flatly as 40 acres of ruined ecclesiastical structure, condition poor, value nominal, Josephine raised her hand before her nerve could fail her, and when no one troubled to bid against a stranger for a pile of crumbling adobe, the claim was hers for $11, the whole of what remained sewn into her hem. She walked back to the mission that same evening, not as a stranger sheltering there, but as its legal owner, and told Refugio, whose eyes filled with tears she tried and failed to hide, that whatever came next, this place would not be taken from her again. It was that same week, helping Refugio clear decades of dust and fallen plaster from behind the old altar to make the sanctuary fit to worship in again, that Josephine's hand found a section of adobe brick that gave slightly under her palm where the rest held firm, and behind it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had somehow survived 40 years of desert heat, she found a wooden box bearing a carved Franciscan seal, and beneath the seal, in careful, faded Spanish script, the words that made her breath catch: "Que Dios perdone a quien lo encuentre, y que la verdad no muera con nosotros." May God forgive whoever finds this, and may the truth not die with us. Inside the box, Josephine found what her grandfather's Latin and her father's careful Spanish lessons had, without either of them ever intending it, prepared her uniquely to read. A set of documents that Padre Anselmo Vega had clearly gathered and hidden in the final desperate weeks before the secularization commissioners arrived to strip the mission of its holdings. The largest document was a formal land grant, dated decades before secularization, bearing the seals of both the mission and the territorial governor's office, establishing that the fertile valley surrounding the mission, the very land that had since been carved up and largely absorbed into the vast holdings of a rancher named Bartholomew Cade, had originally been granted not to the church alone, but jointly to the mission and to the indigenous families who had labored there for generations, along with several settler families who had partnered with them in the valley's early irrigation works. The grant specified, in language Josephine had to read 3 times to be certain she understood it correctly, that upon any secularization or dissolution of the mission's ecclesiastical status, the land was to revert not to the state nor to private purchase, but directly to the named families and their heirs in perpetual common trust, to be shared for grazing and water rights in the manner the mission's own charter had established from its founding. Beneath the grant lay a second document, a personal letter from Padre Vega addressed to whatever future hands might one day find his hidden box, explaining in mournful, careful Spanish that he had watched, in the final months before the commissioner's arrival, a land speculator named Cade insinuate himself into the confidence of the territorial land office, quietly acquiring signatures and filing claims on the valley's most productive parcels under the confusion of the secularization process, exploiting the fact that few of the mission's indigenous families could read the legal Spanish of the documents being pressed upon them, or the English of the American Land Office that would soon replace it entirely. Padre Vega wrote that he had confronted Cade directly and been threatened for his trouble, that he feared for the safety of the families who depended on the mission's protection, and that rather than let the original grant fall into Cade's hands to be destroyed, he had sealed it here, trusting that God would send someone, someday, capable of finishing what he could not. There was a third item in the box beneath the letter and the grant, smaller than the others, a rosary of simple carved wood, worn smooth by decades of handling, and a folded scrap of paper bearing only a list of names in Padre Vega's own hand, family names Josephine did not yet recognize, but would come to know intimately in the weeks ahead. The names of every household the original grant had named as rightful holders of the valley in common. Beside each name, the priest had written a single word in the margin, vivos, meaning living, or defuntos, meaning departed, his own careful, mournful accounting of who among his flock remained to one day claim what he was hiding for them, updated, it seemed, from the varying ink, over several years as he watched his parish slowly scatter and diminish under the pressures Cade's growing influence had placed upon them. Josephine sat on the cool stone floor of the sanctuary with the documents spread before her, Refugio silent and trembling beside her, and understood, with the same steady clarity her father had once brought to a difficult diagnosis, that she was holding proof of a theft that had shaped the fortunes of an entire valley for 40 years, and that the man who had built his empire on that theft was very likely still alive, still powerful, and still very much in Piedra Alta. Bartholomew Cade, Josephine learned within days of making cautious inquiries in town, had indeed prospered enormously in the decades since secularization, expanding his original modest claim into the largest cattle operation in the valley, controlling not only vast acreage but, crucially, the primary irrigation channels that fed every smaller farm downstream of his land, a stranglehold that had quietly ruined more than one independent farmer over the years who dared cross him on water rights or grazing boundaries. He was, by every outward measure, a respected man, a benefactor of the small Protestant church he had built in town, a fixture at civic dinners, the sort of man whose word was taken as law in matters of land and water, because no one had ever possessed the paper to contradict him. When word reached him, as it inevitably did in a town that size, that the strange young woman who had claimed the old mission was going through its ruins with unusual purpose, he rode out himself to see her, arriving with the same easy, unhurried confidence Josephine imagined he brought to every negotiation he had ever won. He offered, without her having said a word about what she'd found, to purchase the mission property from her outright, for a sum far beyond its stated worth, framing it as an act of charity toward a young widow of the trail, with nowhere else to turn, though Josephine had told no one she was widowed, and in fact was not. She recognized the offer immediately for the fear dressed up as generosity that it was, and she declined, telling him only that she intended to restore the mission as her home, and thanked him for his concern. What followed in the weeks after was a slow, deliberate campaign of pressure that Josephine had not expected but should have. The merchant in town who had agreed to sell her building supplies suddenly found his shelves bare whenever she called. The well she and Refugio depended on for irrigation began mysteriously running lower than the season should have allowed. And whispers began circulating that the strange young woman at the old mission was consorting with witchcraft, keeping company with a mad old Indian woman, digging through consecrated ground for reasons no decent person would want to know. Josephine understood, watching this campaign unfold with the same patient clarity her father had taught her to bring to a difficult fever, that Cade could not risk an open confrontation over documents whose existence he did not yet know she possessed, and so instead he was trying, quietly and thoroughly, to make her life in Piedra Alta impossible enough that she would simply leave before ever discovering what the mission had been protecting all along. There was one evening, near the worst of that campaign, when Cade rode out to the mission a second time, alone, arriving at dusk with none of the easy courtesy of his first visit. He stood in the ruined courtyard while Refugio watched warily from the cloistered doorway and told Josephine plainly that a young woman with no husband and no family within 1,000 miles would do well to remember how quickly circumstances could turn against someone with no one to speak for her. That accidents happened to isolated properties all the time. A fire left untended, a well that ran dry, a roof that finally gave way in a storm, and that he would hate to see harm come to her simply because she had chosen, out of some misplaced sentiment, to make an enemy of the one man in the valley who could have been her friend. Josephine felt the threat land exactly as he intended it to, cold and precise. But she thought of her father sitting through the worst of a difficult night, without flinching, and she answered Cade with a steadiness that surprised even her, telling him only that she had survived being left for dead once already, and did not frighten as easily as he seemed to hope. He studied her for a long moment in the fading light, some calculation moving behind his eyes, and then rode off without another word, leaving Josephine to understand that whatever she had found behind that altar, she would need to act on it soon, before his patience for quiet pressure ran out entirely. Rather than confront Cade directly, which she understood would only invite him to move against her before she was ready, Josephine spent the following weeks doing exactly what her father had raised her to do with any difficult case. She gathered what facts she could, methodically and quietly, before acting. She wrote, in her careful bilingual hand, to the Territorial Land Office in the capital, requesting the original secularization filings for the valley, and though it took the better part of 2 months for a response to arrive by slow mail, when it finally did, it confirmed precisely what Padre Vega's hidden letter had described, a pattern of land claims filed in Cade's name during the exact window of the secularization process, several bearing signatures the office's own records noted, in a clerk's dry, marginal comment, as never independently verified against the mission's indigenous residents, whose marks they purported to be. Alongside this, Refugio helped Josephine locate several of the surviving descendants of the mission's original neophyte families who had scattered into the hills and smaller settlements after secularization, but who, remarkably, still told stories among themselves of a valley once shared in common before a rancher's fences went up around what should have belonged to everyone. Josephine visited each family in turn, reading them Padre Vega's letter aloud in Spanish, watching old grief and older hope move across their faces in equal measure, and gathered their willingness to testify to what their own grandparents had told them. Statements that, combined with the original grant and the land office's own confirming records, formed a case no honest court could easily dismiss. When she finally brought the complete case, not to Cade, but to a territorial judge with a reputation for careful, unhurried rulings, in the county seat 2 days' ride from Piedra Alta, Cade was summoned to answer for claims that had, for 40 years, rested on nothing sturdier than the confusion and illiteracy of people he had counted on never being able to contest him. He arrived at the hearing with lawyers and bluster, certain that money and reputation would carry him through as they always had, but faced with an original grant bearing valid territorial seals, land office records confirming irregularities in his own filings, and a dozen sworn statements from families whose grandparents had lived the theft firsthand. Even his own lawyers advised him, in hushed and increasingly urgent tones, that a courtroom fight against this particular ledger of evidence was a fight he stood to lose badly and publicly. The restoration that followed unfolded not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the slow, patient manner Josephine's father had always said true healing required. The judge, unwilling to unravel 4 decades of settlement entirely, ruled instead that the disputed irrigation channels and a substantial portion of the valley's grazing land be restored to common trust exactly as Padre Vega's original grant had specified, administered jointly by the descendant families and, at their own insistence, by Josephine herself as the mission's legal owner and the one who had returned their birthright to them. Cade retained his home ranch and a portion of his herds, enough to live comfortably, though never again, as an unquestioned king of the valley. And the humiliation of the ruling, covered with unflattering thoroughness by the territorial newspapers, cost him far more in standing than it did in acreage. His seat on the county water board was quietly not renewed the following spring. His name no longer invoked with automatic deference at civic dinners, and more than one longtime associate found reasons to distance themselves from a man now publicly known to have built his fortune on the theft of illiterate families' birthright. Josephine used her own restored authority over the mission not to enrich herself, but to see the old irrigation works repaired for every family the grant had named, funding the labor in part with a modest allowance the court granted her for the mission's restoration, and turning the mission's old cloister, with Refugio's guidance, into both a working chapel and a school, the first the valley had seen since secularization, where the children of families long denied an education could learn, as Josephine herself had once learned from her father, that a mind sharp enough to learn deserved the teaching regardless of what the world expected of it. Refugio lived to see the mission bell rung for the first time in 40 years. Standing beside Josephine in the restored sanctuary with tears she no longer bothered to hide, and told her in the careful English she had practiced all those weeks of Josephine's recovery, that her grandmother's faith in a priest's hidden secret had finally been rewarded. 4 decades, and one dying stranger's fortunate footsteps later, Caleb, the young driver who had once protested Kettering's decision on the trail, arrived at the mission unannounced some months after the ruling, having heard through the slow chain of frontier gossip what had become of the girl he'd watched left behind in the dust. And he stood in the restored courtyard turning his hat over in his hands, unable at first to find the words to apologize for a decision that had never been his to make. Josephine, who had long since stopped carrying anger toward a frightened 17-year-old following orders, told him only that he had nothing to answer for, and offered him work helping repair the old irrigation gates if he cared to stay, which he did, becoming in time as steady a fixture of the restored valley as the mission bell itself. She was 21 years old when a wagon master decided her life was worth less than the hours it would cost to save it, and she had believed, in the fevered hours of crawling toward a crumbling bell tower on the horizon, that she was simply looking for anywhere to die that wasn't open ground under an indifferent sky. But her father had spent a lifetime teaching her that patience was not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength there was. The strength to keep doing careful work when no reward is promised. And that a healer's hands and a mind trained to read what others could not were gifts that might matter in ways neither of them could have predicted. Josephine Calder did not set out to unmake a rancher's empire or restore a valley's birthright. She only set out, in the desperate arithmetic of a dying girl with almost nothing, to survive one more hour, and then one more day, trusting an old woman's herbs and her own father's teaching to carry her through. What she found sealed behind that altar was never really a treasure in the way the word usually means. It was a dying priest's last act of protection for people he loved, entrusted to whatever hands might one day be patient enough, and honest enough, and prepared enough by their own hard road to finish what he began. She thought often, in the years that followed, of almost Kettering, and found that she carried no bitterness toward him worth the keeping. He had made his hard calculation on a riverbank in a moment of panic, the same way Bartholomew Cade had once made his own calculation in a moment of opportunity. And Josephine had come to understand that the truest answer to both men was not anger, but simply outliving their arithmetic and building something neither of them had thought her capable of building. The mission that Amos Kettering never imagined she would reach now stands restored at the center of a valley once again held in common the way its founding grant intended, and above its sanctuary door, Josephine had carved, in both Spanish and English, the words Padre Vega had trusted to a hiding place for 40 years, Que la verdad no muera, let the truth not die. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Josephine and with us. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs the reminder that even a life written off as already lost can still hold something the world has not finished needing. We would love to know where you are watching from tonight, so leave it for us in the comments, wherever in the world that may be. And we will leave you, as always, with a question worth sitting with. What is a time you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already decided to leave behind? Until next time, stay close.